is the final line of defense. If the resistance compromises it, we are doomed.
You can't do this. You cannot do this.
There's nothing we can't do.
It's real.
Burn it. I can only hope one day to be as uncompromising as you.
Preston, you're a family man.
They're a boy and a girl.
Don't move! Don't move! It's the lawful entry. We have a warrant for your wife's arrest.
They trained you your whole life to fight these kind of odds.
I've heard the most disturbing
Rumor, sir.
a rumor maintaining that one of the cleric is actually attempting to contact the resistance.
Then you know what I'm gonna do now.
Some performances are remembered for how they look on screen. Others are remembered for what it took to create them. This one belongs to the second category. The transformation wasn't just physical. It wasn't limited to weight, muscle, or a suit designed to intimidate. It was behavioral, vocal, psychological, a constant tightening of control that didn't always stop when the cameras did. To the audience, the result felt iconic, cold, intense, uncompromising. A hero who looked like he carried the weight of his choices in every movement. But behind that precision was a process driven by obsession, not balance. Perfection became non-negotiable. Control became a necessity. And the line between discipline and fixation began to blur. This wasn't about method acting in the traditional sense. It was about domination. Over the body, over emotion, over environment. Everything had to bend toward the character, even when the cost started showing in moments that weren't meant to be part of the performance. For Christian Bale, stepping into Batman during The Dark Knight wasn't just about playing a role. It was about becoming immovable. And in that pursuit, something quietly crossed a line, turning dedication into something far more volatile than anyone expected. Intensity has always been mistaken for control. In performance, it often looks like focus, like discipline, like commitment elevated to something admirable. But there is a point where intensity stops serving the work and starts demanding obedience from everyone around it. That line is rarely obvious in the moment. In the years leading up to The Dark Knight, the expectation was not simply to repeat a success. It was to harden it, to sharpen it, to transform a symbol into something colder, heavier, and more imposing. The character required authority, restraint, and an unyielding presence, someone who didn't just look powerful, but operated as if weakness had been surgically removed. That mandate shaped everything that followed. The preparation was not casual. It was engineered. Body, voice, posture, movement. Each element refined toward dominance. This wasn't about inhabiting a mindset temporarily. It was about enforcing it consistently. The performance demanded a kind of rigidity that left little room for flexibility. And rigidity, when sustained, can turn volatile. On set, the atmosphere was controlled, deliberate, tightly managed. The character wasn't something to be accessed, it was something to be maintained. Staying in that state became a priority. Breaking it felt like compromise, and compromise felt like failure. This is how obsession disguises itself as professionalism. The voice, in particular, became a focal point. It wasn't just a stylistic choice, it was an assertion. A sound designed to intimidate, to dominate every interaction. But maintaining that vocal strain required constant tension. It demanded the body remain braced, the breath controlled, the jaw set. Over time, that tension doesn't dissipate when the camera cuts. It accumulates. The performance thrived on containment, emotions locked down, reactions measured, presence unwavering. That containment was effective on screen. It projected authority. It reinforced fearlessness. But containment off-screen has consequences. It compresses stress inward. And compressed stress seeks release. This wasn't about anger as temperament. It was about pressure without relief. Long hours. High stakes. A production that allowed little margin for error. Expectations stacked on expectations. And a process that treated disruption as a threat to precision. In that environment, patience thins. Moments that would normally pass without incident become flashpoints. Corrections feel like challenges. delays feel like disrespect. And when the need for control goes unchallenged for long enough, it begins to justify itself. This is where stories usually become simplified. They get reduced to a single incident, stripped of context, framed as personality rather than process. But processes create behavior. Environments amplify tendencies. And when the work rewards intensity, intensity escalates. What's often overlooked is that this wasn't an isolated approach. It was consistent with a pattern of total immersion, a belief that the best work comes from absolute commitment, even if that commitment narrows everything else. That belief can produce extraordinary results. It can also fracture working relationships. Because filmmaking is collaborative by nature, it requires adjustment, interruption, negotiation. Obsession resists all three. It demands conditions be optimized and preserved. And when those conditions are disrupted, the response can be disproportionate. Not because of malice, but because the internal equilibrium is fragile. When you build a performance on sustained tension, any external disruption feels like destabilization. The reaction isn't calculated. It's reflexive. And reflexive reactions, under stress, tend to overshoot. The irony is that the very thing that makes such performances compelling, the sense of total control, is often maintained through constant internal strain. The actor becomes both enforcer and captive of the method. This doesn't make the work illegitimate, it makes it costly. What complicates this further is success. When the results are undeniable, the process is rarely questioned. Praise validates behavior. Acclaim reframes excess as dedication. And boundaries that might otherwise be enforced remain flexible until they're crossed. By the time tension surfaces publicly, it's usually the endpoint of a much longer buildup. Accumulated fatigue, unreleased pressure, a system that equates seriousness with severity. All of it converging in a moment that draws attention not because it's unique, but because it's visible. Visibility invites judgment, but judgment without context misses the core issue. The real question isn't whether obsession went too far, it's why going too far felt necessary. Why restraint felt incompatible with authenticity. Why maintaining control required constant vigilance. Those answers lie in how the character was constructed. This version of the role was designed to be uncompromising, to feel burdensome, to operate under constant strain. And embodying that convincingly meant living inside a compressed emotional range for months. There was no release valve built into that design. When release is delayed long enough, it finds its own outlet. That doesn't excuse behavior, but it explains it. Understanding the difference matters because it reveals a broader pattern, one that extends beyond a single production or individual. It points to how extreme commitment is incentivized without being managed, how intensity is celebrated without containment, how obsession is praised until it disrupts the system that enabled it. And by then, the narrative has already hardened. The performance endures. The image becomes iconic. The complexity of the process fades into anecdote. What remains is the myth of dedication, and the cost quietly absorbed by everyone involved. As production moved deeper into its most demanding stretch, the strain stopped being abstract and started becoming operational. Days ran long, adjustments multiplied. Small inefficiencies, normally absorbed by collaboration, began to feel intolerable. When a process is built on sustained tension, even minor disruptions register as threats. This is where pressure becomes personal. The commitment to control had worked until it didn't. Maintaining the character required an unbroken chain of conditions: focus, authority, precision. When any link weakened, the response wasn't deliberation, it was reaction. Not because of temperament alone, but because the internal equilibrium depended on continuity. Continuity, however, is fragile on a film set. Crews rotate, schedules slip, decisions change, and when someone is operating at the edge of endurance, those realities collide with expectations in unpredictable ways. The body is already taxed. The mind is already compressed. There is no surplus patience to draw from. What followed wasn't sudden. It was cumulative. Each correction felt sharper, each delay heavier, each request more intrusive. And when pressure accumulates without release, it seeks a moment, any moment, to discharge. Not strategically, but explosively. This is the point most accounts focus on because it's visible. But visibility is misleading. It frames the issue as a single failure rather than a system reaching its limit. It ignores the weeks of strain that made that moment inevitable. The confrontation that ultimately defined this phase wasn't about power or ego in isolation. It was about a system built around total control, encountering variables it couldn't contain. When control becomes the primary coping mechanism, losing it, even briefly, feels catastrophic. That's when intensity flips. What had been disciplined becomes aggressive. What had been focused becomes inflexible. And what had been contained seeks release in the most immediate way available. The reaction is disproportionate, not because the trigger is large, but because the pressure behind it is. Afterward, attention narrows to the incident itself. Language hardens, labels form, the narrative simplifies. But simplification misses the mechanics of what actually happened. This wasn't a breakdown of professionalism. It was professionalism pushed past its functional limit. The aftermath forced a recalibration, not just for one person, but for the production as a whole. Boundaries that had been flexible were suddenly explicit. Conversations shifted. Oversight increased. The system adjusted because it had to. This is how industries respond. Not preemptively, but reactively. What's rarely discussed is how close this pattern comes to being normalized. Extreme dedication is encouraged. Long hours are expected. Emotional compression is praised as seriousness. But safeguards are minimal, and recovery is assumed rather than structured. The moment something goes wrong, the focus turns to individual accountability, necessary but incomplete. Accountability addresses behavior. It does not address conditions. Conditions are where repetition is prevented. In this case, the work continued. The performance remained uncompromised. The film moved forward. And the result, when released, validated the intensity that produced it. Critical acclaim reframed the process as effective, even if uncomfortable. That validation is complicated. It sends a message that extreme methods are justified by extreme results. That control is worth the cost. That obsession, if it delivers, will be tolerated. And that message echoes long after the immediate consequences fade. But there's a quieter outcome that matters more. The experience forced an internal reassessment. Not of commitment, but of limits. Not of seriousness, but of sustainability. Because whatever the audience sees on screen, the body remembers what it took to get there. And bodies keep score. The recognition that followed did not erase the toll. It contextualized it. It placed a marker at the edge of what could be endured without fracture. And once that edge is known, it can't be unknown. This is where maturity enters the picture, not as moderation, but as precision. Knowing when intensity serves the work and when it begins to dominate it. Knowing when control clarifies and when it constricts. The role demanded authority. The process demanded endurance. But the lesson that emerged demanded restraint. Restraint isn't the absence of commitment. It's the intelligent allocation of it. What this phase revealed is that obsession doesn't announce itself as excess. It presents as necessity. It argues that without it, the work will fail. And when that argument goes unchallenged long enough, it becomes doctrine. Doctrine is hard to interrupt. The industry's response to this moment was telling. There was acknowledgement, there were consequences, and then there was continuation. Because the machine is designed to keep moving, it absorbs disruption and resumes. But individuals carry residue. The residue here wasn't bitterness or defensiveness. It was awareness. Awareness that the method had worked, but at a price that could not be ignored again without escalation. That escalation, if repeated, would not end as a moment. It would end as damage. That realization reframed future choices, not toward softness, but toward control of a different kind. Control that includes release valves. Control that recognizes fatigue as information, not weakness. Control that preserves collaboration rather than overpowering it. The irony is that this shift doesn't dilute intensity. It refines it. The performance in The Dark Knight stands as proof of what obsession can achieve. But it also stands as a boundary marker, an example of how close the process came to becoming unsustainable. With time, the incident stopped being the focus and became a reference point. Not a scandal to be defended or dismissed, but a moment that clarified something deeper about limits. personal, professional, and structural. The work was finished. The film moved into post-production. Distance returned. And with distance came perspective. What stood out wasn't regret, it was recognition. Recognition that the process had crossed from discipline into domination. That control, when pursued without interruption, doesn't just shape performance, it reshapes behavior. And once that shift happens, it doesn't reverse on its own. It requires conscious recalibration. This is where obsession reveals its final cost, not in public fallout, but in the private realization that the method worked too well, that it delivered the result while quietly undermining the conditions needed to repeat it safely. When success validates excess, excess becomes harder to question. But the body questions it anyway. Fatigue lingers. Tension leaves residue. The nervous system remembers prolonged vigilance long after the circumstances change. These aren't dramatic symptoms. They're subtle adjustments that affect patience, perception, and responsiveness. The lesson wasn't to abandon intensity. It was to redefine control. True control isn't rigidity. It's adaptability. The ability to enter intensity and exit it deliberately. To access authority without enforcing dominance. To commit without narrowing everything else out of existence. That distinction matters more with time. As careers extend, sustainability becomes the real measure of seriousness. Not how far someone is willing to push once, but how consistently they can deliver without collapse. Obsession produces peaks, sustainability produces longevity, and longevity requires boundaries. The mythology of extreme dedication often ignores this. It celebrates the breaking point as proof of authenticity. But breaking points don't build careers. They interrupt them. They fracture trust. They create caution where confidence once existed. This experience quietly shifted how commitment was understood. Not as constant escalation, but as calibrated intensity. Choosing when to push and when to pause. When to tighten control and when to release it. That shift isn't visible on screen, but it's decisive behind it. The irony is that the performance itself didn't need obsession to succeed. It needed clarity, precision, and presence. The obsession didn't enhance those qualities, it amplified them past equilibrium. And equilibrium is what allows collaboration to function. Collaboration is the hidden casualty of unchecked intensity. When one person carries all the tension, the system destabilizes. Others compensate. Communication tightens. Creativity narrows. The work may survive, but the environment suffers. That suffering doesn't always leave records, it leaves impressions. And impressions shape how future projects are approached, by everyone involved. What emerged from this chapter wasn't defensiveness or denial, it was restraint sharpened by experience. A clearer understanding of where pressure should be applied, and where it should not. That understanding doesn't weaken authority, it makes it usable. The version of commitment that followed was quieter, but more controlled, less volatile, more precise. The intensity remained, but it was no longer allowed to dictate everything else. That's not compromise, that's evolution. The industry often frames stories like this as cautionary tales. But the more accurate framing is diagnostic. They reveal where systems encourage imbalance, where intensity goes unregulated, and where success masks instability. This wasn't a story about losing control completely. It was about coming close enough to understand what happens when control becomes the only tool left. The line between mastery and collapse isn't crossed suddenly. It's approached gradually, through reinforcement, reward, and repetition. Each success pushes the line further out. Each validation makes the method harder to question, until something breaks the pattern. In this case, it wasn't the performance that broke. It was the illusion that obsession was sustainable. That illusion is common in high-stakes creative work. It whispers that discomfort is necessary, that pressure is productive, that control must be absolute. And sometimes it's right, temporarily. But permanence demands something else. The legacy of this chapter isn't controversy. It's clarity. Clarity about how far intensity can go before it turns against the work it's meant to serve. Clarity about the cost of confusing seriousness with severity. And clarity about the fact that obsession is a tool, not a foundation. The performance stands, the film endures. But what truly lasts is the recalibration that followed. Because the greatest risk wasn't the outburst. It was repeating the conditions that made it inevitable. And avoiding that repetition required recognizing that obsession, once it goes too far, stops being dedication and starts demanding payment. With enough distance, what once felt like an isolated moment begins to look like a signal. Not a failure of character, but a warning about systems that reward intensity without regulating it. The story, when viewed whole, isn't about a single confrontation or a single production. It's about how obsession can quietly become policy when results justify the cost. After the dust settled, there was no public reckoning that changed the industry overnight. There never is. The machine moved forward, as it always does. Films release, acclaim follows, narratives simplify, and complexity is archived. But privately, something had shifted. The experience drew a clear line between intensity that serves the work and intensity that consumes it. That line isn't theoretical, it's physical, emotional, relational. Once crossed, it leaves traces: fatigue that lingers, patience that thins more quickly, and an awareness that control, when stretched too far, fractures collaboration. The hardest part of recognizing this is that obsession often feels productive right up until it isn't. It creates momentum. It sharpens focus. It filters out distraction. And when the outcome succeeds, it retroactively validates the process. That validation is powerful. It convinces people that discomfort is a necessary ingredient rather than a warning sign. But discomfort isn't the same as pressure. And pressure isn't the same as precision. Precision allows adjustment. Obsession resists it. What this chapter revealed was the danger of mistaking dominance for mastery. Dominance imposes order by force. Mastery creates order through understanding. One escalates when challenged. The other adapts. Adaptation is the quieter skill. Over time, the recalibration became visible not in statements, but in choices. In how intensity was deployed rather than sustained. In how authority was expressed without compression. In how control shifted from being enforced to being designed. This didn't dilute the work. It stabilized it. Stability is not a lack of seriousness. It's the condition that allows seriousness to last. And longevity, not spectacle, is what ultimately defines a career. The industry tends to mythologize extremes because they make for compelling stories. They're easier to package than restraint, easier to admire than boundaries. But extremes don't scale. They burn resources, human ones most of all. And when human resources burn out, the cost isn't just personal. It's systemic. Sets become volatile. Collaboration narrows, creativity contracts, the work survives, but the environment deteriorates. That deterioration is rarely visible to audiences, but it accumulates behind the scenes. This is why stories like this matter, not as moral judgments, but as diagnostics. They reveal how far systems will go to protect results, and how long individuals will push themselves to meet expectations that were never meant to be permanent. The performance in The Dark Knight remains iconic because it captured something uncompromising. But the process behind it exposed something equally important: the limit of uncompromising methods. Limits aren't failures, they're boundaries. And boundaries are what allow intensity to be revisited without escalation. The real evolution here wasn't a rejection of dedication. It was a refinement of it. Dedication that includes recovery. Focus that allows interruption. Control that accounts for human variability. That kind of dedication doesn't make headlines, but it makes careers sustainable. Looking back, the obsession didn't go too far because it produced conflict. It went too far because it left no margin, no buffer for error, no space for recalibration. And when margins disappear, systems become brittle. Brittle systems don't bend, they break. This story sits at the intersection of performance, pressure, and expectation. It shows how easily excellence can tip into excess when intensity is left unchecked. And it reminds us that the cost of obsession is rarely paid in one moment, it's paid over time. What endures is not the volatility, but the adjustment that followed it. Because the most meaningful outcome wasn't controversy. It was clarity. Clarity about the difference between commitment and compulsion. Clarity about the necessity of containment. And clarity about the fact that obsession, when left unmanaged, eventually demands payment from everyone involved. The performance stands as a testament to what intensity can achieve. The aftermath stands as a reminder of what intensity must be balanced with. And that balance, quiet, deliberate, and often invisible, is what allows great work to continue without consuming the people who create it. If this story changed how you think about dedication, obsession, and the hidden cost of great performances, stay with the channel. Here, we go beyond iconic scenes to examine what they demand, what they expose, and what they cost the people behind them. We don't chase headlines, we unpack the psychology beneath them. Subscribe for deeper documentary-style breakdowns of legendary performances, creative pressure, and the unseen boundaries that separate mastery from burnout. And if there's another role or artist whose process deserves this level of honest analysis, share it in the comments. Because the most important stories aren't about how intense the work looks, they're about how long the people doing it can last.